So good morning, everyone. Welcome to another installment of our Equality, Diversity and Inclusion webinar series at the Harlequins Foundation. We really appreciate you joining us today. We'll be addressing disability inclusion, focusing on language, terminology and best practice. We are very pleased to be joined by Daniel Townley from Level Playing Field, who will be delivering the presentation this morning before opening up to a Q&A. Daniel heads up Level Playing Field's Disability and Inclusion Training Service, delivering awareness training to club staff across various sports. He also liaises with disability access officers in various sports institutions, helping to provide a better matchday experience for disabled supporters. Just so everyone is aware, we are utilising the Q&A feature today, so please put any questions in for Daniel to cover in the Q&A session. And I think we are ready to go. Daniel, over to you.
Great, thanks for that. I was going to do a bit of an introduction, but I think you did a pretty good job. I don't think I need to say any more than that. So yeah, that's who I am. I'm just going to share my PowerPoint with you all. There you go. Hopefully everyone's seeing that. I'm not used to delivering training without being able to see or hear people, so this is new to me, but I am assured that you're out there. So yes, welcome. I'm going to go through some of what I would go through when doing disability inclusion training, but I won't be covering everything. But yeah, hope you find this morning helpful, just as a bit of an introduction, really. So just to share a little bit more about Level Playing Field, who we are, what we do. We have four kind of key pillars, which is for the fans. So we do a lot of work engaging with disabled supporters, finding out their experience of attending live sports. For the clubs, all the sort of the information that we get from supporters and from government guidance and other things we share with clubs to try and help them to improve their services and facilities for disabled supporters. We run a campaign, so we run one big annual campaign, which is our Weeks of Action, which was actually the end of February into March of this year. So you might have seen some things around our Weeks of Action, just really raising awareness about the importance of disabled access at sporting venues. And then finally, Knowledge Centre is our final pillar. Obviously, there's no good with us being kind of the leading charity for disabled supporters of sports clubs if we don't know our stuff. So we try as best we can to stay on top of updates to legislation and guidance. The big thing recently, obviously, has been COVID and making sure that we understand how that is going to impact on disabled supporters. Just to share a few facts and figures with you, this is an infographic that we put together. I'm not going to go through everything on here, but just the key things to highlight, just up in the top left corner, is that there are 14.1 million disabled people in the UK, which is approximately 21% of the UK population. So when we're thinking about disability, we need to be thinking about it quite broadly, and in terms of the fact that it's 1 in 5 people in the UK has a disability of some kind. And so disability is actually the largest minority group in the UK, and generally speaking in any population group. And yet, if you look at this stat on the right, 50% of disabled people have never attended a live entertainment or sports event. So this was a statistic that was put together by our partner charity, Cafe, who do a very similar job to us, but across Europe. And this was research that they did that discovered that 50% of people have never attended a live entertainment or sports event. And obviously within that 50%, you're going to have lots of people who don't care about sport, who would have no interest in going along to a match. But within that 50%, there'll be some surely who would want to, but who maybe feel like there are too many barriers in place or too many things stopping them from attending. So what might those things be? What might that look like? Well, here's an example for you. So this was a tweet that was posted out by Sky Sports just earlier this year in January, and it said this: colorblind football fans were left angry and confused after they struggled to tell the teams apart when Liverpool played rivals Man United at the weekend. So yeah, that's fair enough. This was a response that was given by somebody who was colorblind, Apologies for the word arse in here, but I mean, angry and confused is a bit of an overstatement, but it was a pain in the arse. Here's how it looked for me, hashtag 1 in 12, because 1 in 12 men are colorblind. And the responses that this tweet got were as follows. How do you know it looked like that if you can't tell? So now we have to cater for colorblind people with football strips so not to upset people. This is getting out of hand. What's next? Every day someone or a group is offended. There's always something to complain about. Maybe the fact they're colorblind is the problem, not the club's issue. And just finally, simply, who cares? So I hope you can appreciate that, you know, we haven't had to look particularly hard to find this example. All of these replies were just to this single tweet, which just shows that there's still very much an attitude out there of why should we have to change our world to accommodate disabled people? Why should we have to make adjustments? Why should we have to change anything in order just to accommodate a few people? And the emphasis there is very much on the disabled people. It's their fault, it's their issue. They're the ones who are colorblind, so why should we have to change? And sadly, this is still something that happens. This is still sort of commonplace now. But it's very much a medical model. For those of you who joined this webinar, which Owen did a while back, he talked about the social model of disability. So apologies if you've heard this already, but I'm just going to go through it again because I feel like it's important. The social model of disability is a new way of looking at disability that replaces the old medical model. So previously, the medical model of disability would have placed all the emphasis, all the focus on the disabled person. What can't they do? What is their body stopping them from being able to do? What do we need to maybe even heal about that person in order for them to fully integrate into society? The social model has replaced that model. The social model is now the sort of accepted model within government and other areas. And instead of placing all the emphasis on disabled person about what they can and what they can't do, it essentially says, well, what's wrong with the environment? What's wrong with the way that our society has been built? In what ways are those things disabling people? Going back to the statistic that 1 in 5 people are disabled, actually, this isn't a small minority of people. This is a lot of people, and we need to build our environments better. We need to build our societies better in order to accommodate everybody and to include everybody as much as possible. And so the social model of disability has talks about 3 main types of barriers, which is environments, which is kind of the built world, organizations, which is the policies and decisions that organizations make that could cause barriers for disabled people, and then attitudes. We just experienced some attitudes from those tweets which can cause barriers for disabled people. It can make them feel like they're not included or not welcome in certain venues and places. This is just another quick sort of graphic to explain one principle. Oftentimes when we talk about equality, actually what we really mean is equity. And I don't mind using the word equality, but this just helps to sort of illustrate the difference. When we talk about equality, essentially what we're talking about is providing the same thing for everybody. And as you can see in this top picture here, that's actually not suitable in this case. These people have all been given a bike that's exactly the same, but actually it's only really suitable for one of those 4 people in the top picture. And then in the lower picture, equity, which is sort of about fairness, is showing that actually you're still providing each person with a bike, with one bike, but the bikes have to be different in order to be suitable for them. And this just essentially illustrates the point that in order to treat people fairly, it actually might mean treating them differently. That might seem counterintuitive, but actually in terms of disability access, people have different access requirements. Everybody wants to be treated as a person, as an individual, but actually their access requirements might look different. So to treat people fairly might actually mean to treat them differently. This is another sort of thing that, another article that was just from the end of last year. So this is, it says there, November 17th, 2020, and this is Michael J. Fox, the Back to the Future actor. For those of you who don't know, Michael J. Fox has Parkinson's, which is a degenerative disease, and Michael sometimes requires use of a wheelchair and sometimes he doesn't. And in this article, he talks about the difference he experiences from spending time in a wheelchair and when he's not using a wheelchair. And this headline sort of tells the story, really. In the wheelchair, I'm luggage. No one listens to luggage. And just reading through the article, he just describes, it's quite heartbreaking, really. Essentially, you know, he doesn't really want to ever use a wheelchair because people treat him so differently when he's in a wheelchair. And actually, there's a lot of kind of fear, I think, that people have of speaking to disabled people. They worry about saying the wrong thing. They worry about using the wrong language. They worry about causing offence. And Michael's experience is just one example of that. People almost forget to treat him as a person, treat him as a human being when he's in a wheelchair, as opposed to when he's walking. These are some photos that my boss took just in the area where he lives. And again, this just shows that kind of caveat to access. So each of these different venues, in theory, is providing access to disabled people. But in each case, there's almost like an asterisk with that to say, yes, we're accessible, but. So the first one is, disabled persons, please ring the bell for assistance, because obviously they can't use the steps. Then here in the middle picture, examination and step-free entrance is 40 meters round to the left for disabled people, or the main entrance is 20 meters ahead. And then finally, this was for a restaurant, disabled access to the rear. In order to access the restaurant, they had to go around the back of the building, past down an alleyway through where all the smelly bins were, in order to be able to go into the restaurant. And again, these are just a few simple illustrations that, you know, they didn't really have to be looked for very hard. In each of these cases, you could say, well, you know, they're making themselves accessible. But in each case, if you are disabled, if you are somebody who is a wheelchair user, and you're wanting to gain access to these buildings, do you feel as valued as others? Do you feel as included? Do you feel as though you're as much of a priority? Probably not. This is it says discussion. Normally I will run this as a sort of a discussion, but obviously it's just me speaking, so I'll discuss on your behalf. Have a look at this picture for a second, this signage, and have a think about, does this signage reflect an inclusive attitude? So when I've asked groups about this in the past, usually the thing that they notice more than anything else is the fact that there's a picture of a lady here who's changing the baby, and they think, well, that's not very 21st century, that's not very equal. Actually, they could have had a man changing the baby instead. In the times that I've run this as a sort of discussion, nobody's ever really talked about the picture of the wheelchair user. And so I'm going to sort of draw your attention to the fact that it looks really weird. You might not have really sort of noticed at first, but if you actually really look at it, the wheel of this wheelchair user is floating about 2 feet off the ground. Their foot is much lower than the wheel, and the wheel goes from their knee to their neck. There's also not really any kind of design that's gone into this. If you look at the two pictures either side, they've obviously spent some time and effort trying to sort of flesh out the people and to make them look a little bit more human. There's not really any sort of design work that's gone into the wheelchair user. Let me show you this one as a comparison. So have a look at this one in comparison. How much better does that look? How much more consistent does that look with those other pictures, for example? The wheels actually touching the floor for a start. And the point that I'm making about this isn't just that signage should be good and consistent, which it should, but what are you communicating to disabled people through the decisions that you make, even about signage? If you're a disabled person and you see that signage, yes, everybody knows that that wheelchair user means that it's, you know, it's an accessible toilet facility, but that's not the point. Are you communicating that that person is as valued, as included, as valued a member of society? So we need to really put ourselves into the mindset of disabled people, because the reality is that probably most of us wouldn't really have noticed that, but we're not, if you're not looking for it, you're not going to see it. So we need to put ourselves into the mindset of people, of somebody with a disability, and just start to think about our built environments, think about the policies that we make, think about things like our signage and what are we communicating with those. So it's one thing to meet the minimum legal requirements for accessibility, but it's another thing to strive to be as inclusive and accessible as possible. I'm just going to show you a brief clip. So I'm going to talk a little bit more now about interacting with disabled people, thinking about terminology and best practice. So I'm just going to show you a brief video clip. This is a video that was done by Scope, and hopefully you should be able to see and hear this okay.
2/3 of British people feel awkward around disability. Scope are teaming up with the Southern Cooperative to help end the awkward. We used actors to show real-life stories.
A car drives into the disabled parking bay of a co-op store. Two young women glance up surreptitiously as they pass. Inside the store, a young blind woman with a guide dog is approached by a customer.
Excuse me, do you need any help? Are you okay?
Yes, that would be great. Would you mind helping me find some flowers?
Yes, come this way.
The woman looks at her admiringly.
I think you're so brave for coming out on your own and doing the shopping by yourself.
The black guide dog looks up as if in surprise. In an aisle, a man with dwarfism hails an assistant.
Excuse me, mate.
Yeah?
Could you reach me down a tin of tomatoes, please?
Absolutely.
The assistant takes a tin of tomatoes off the shelf. He has second thoughts and takes a smaller tin.
Actually, I think these are being more manageable for you to carry.
The assistant crouches down and grins. The customer looks at the tin, perplexed. A wheelchair user and his non-disabled friend are at the checkout.
Lovely day.
The cashier speaks to the non-disabled man.
Strawberries, my favourite.
We like strawberries.
The woman grins at the disabled man. To the other man.
That's £8.80, please.
Disabled man.
Sorry, how much?
£8.80, please.
The disabled man pays.
Thank you.
Thank you.
She gives the change to the non-disabled man.
Here's your change and your receipt.
Thank you.
She looks at the disabled man wide-eyed.
Have a nice day.
Feeling awkward yet? It doesn't have to be.
The car drives into the parking bay as the girls pass. The driver lifts his wheelchair out of the boot, sits in the chair and speaks to us.
Not all impairments are visible.
He wheels towards the girls as they head into the shop.
Yeah.
In the store, the blind woman is approached by the customer.
Excuse me, do you need any help? Are you
The
okay?
blind woman turns to us.
Remember, help is always welcome. But I'm blind, not deaf.
It's just a couple of
In the
seconds.
aisle, the man with dwarfism stops the shop assistant.
Excuse me, mate.
To us.
Shopping can be annoying at the best of times. If asked for help, I really appreciate it. But please don't make assumptions. Excuse me, mate. Could you pass down the tin of tomatoes, please?
Yeah, sure, no worries. Here we go.
Thanks.
Cashier.
That's £8.80, please.
Sorry, how much?
Disabled man to us.
Just because I'm disabled, you don't need to feel awkward. Just talk to me like anybody
The
else.
cashier smiles at the disabled man.
There's your change and your receipt. Have a nice day.
Find out more about how you can end the awkward at scope.org.uk.
Okay. Apologies, I appreciate that's quite cheesy in places, and there's not going to be any awards won for acting anytime soon. But it just helps to illustrate some points. As it said at the start, 2/3 of people feel awkward around disability. So that's research that was done by Scope. That's a lot of people. You know, obviously two-thirds people, 2 in every 3 people are going to feel awkward speaking to somebody who's disabled, and that might be fear of saying the wrong thing. That might be fear of offending. But actually, as it said at the end there, we just need to remember, actually, when we're speaking to disabled people, we're just speaking to people at the end of the day. They might just have different access requirements. But there are just a few sort of hints and tips. Many of them were covered in that video, but just obviously be aware you might need to take your time, particularly if somebody is having difficulty speaking. Just allow extra time. Don't rush. Don't feel rushed. Make eye contact. This is one of the things that we get told about by disabled supporters, that they don't feel valued. They don't feel like they're treated as people because they're not being looked at. Obviously, speaking to the disabled person rather than their personal assistant or a carer. Not to be dismissive or patronising. Again, this is something that we hear about quite a lot from disabled supporters, that they don't feel like they're taken seriously. They feel like their issues or their complaints are dismissed, or that they're being patronised to. So being called inspirational, you know, for attending a match, or being told that they're so brave for coming out. For the majority of disabled people, they would see that as quite patronising. One thing that it could be tempting to do if you are speaking to somebody who's really having difficulty speaking is to sort of want to rush and help them, or to finish their sentences. But that can be, you know, that's not really pleasant for any of us to have our sentences finished by somebody else. So yeah, be mindful not to do that. And really just to be mindful that to be flexible, because disabilities differ. There's an expression that if you've met one person with autism, then you've met one person with autism. And the idea that, you know, just because you have sort of met somebody with a particular disability doesn't mean that you completely understand that, and that the next person that you meet with that disability is going to behave in the same way. Disabilities do differ. And just if you're not sure, ask. And this is, you know, this is to say you can ask the disabled person themselves if you're not sure about something, if you want to clarify. But also you can feel free to ask us as Level Playing Field. We are set up as an advisory service. So if you ever have any questions, then you can get in touch with us. Just a few points on evolving language. Obviously, I wanted to get that out of the way first to say, you know, be confident when talking to disabled people, and remember that they are just people. This is just drilling down into a bit more detail on language itself. So on the left here, there are some terms that are now outdated, and I'm going to show on the right the terms that they're replaced with. So instead of talking about somebody, apologies if you find any of these terms offensive, by the way, I'm just using them to say that they're not appropriate. So crippled, invalid, or the disabled, instead talk about disabled person or disabled people. Instead of able-bodied, we talk about non-disabled. There's a good reason for this. You might have heard the term able-bodied and think that there's nothing wrong with that. But actually, if we think back to the social model of disability, the fact that people are disabled by their environments and disabled by the things that are out in society that cause those barriers, actually for everyone else, they're just not disabled by those things. So we're non-disabled. The term spastic has now been replaced with person with cerebral palsy. We don't talk about somebody being wheelchair bound anymore. They're just a wheelchair user. Instead of deaf and dumb or deaf mute, we say deaf or hard of hearing. Instead of fits, spells, or attacks, we talk about seizures. So somebody with epilepsy might have seizures rather than fits. Don't talk about mentally handicapped or retarded. Hopefully it's clear that they're now outdated words. Talk about learning disabilities. Instead of using the terms insane or mad, we'll talk about a person with mental health condition. And just to illustrate the point that this is an evolving thing, this is not static, these words change over time. Even this last one, person with mental health condition, there's not consensus really over that terminology at the moment, even amongst the leading kind of mental health charities and organizations. Some will prefer mental health condition, some might say mental health issues. Mental health illness is another term. There's not really consensus over the right terminology on that one. So it might be that in the next few years there's consensus, but at the moment there isn't. When we think about how we can start to improve our communication, particularly in a club setting, these are some things that different clubs have started to do recently. So one is to use audio description. And there was an example of audio description in that video from Scope that we just watched, the man who's sort of narrating in the background, that's an example of audio description. So when it says, you know, a man's just walked into the shop from the left to the right, and that's audio description. And that's starting to be used more and more now in sports grounds, where it's not just commentary, but it gives a much richer, much fuller flavour, a picture of what's going on. They talk a lot more about the action and what's happening in greater detail for people who are blind or partially sighted. PECS is Picture Exchange Communication System. These are tools that are starting to be used. They could be used at a club, at the food outlets or in the club shop, something like that. But again, if somebody is unable to communicate verbally, then this is something you could use as a picture board for them just to point to. And clubs are starting to create their own, and just as a simple alternative to help facilitate communication. Many clubs are providing sensory packs, which might include tools to help facilitate communication. There's oftentimes sort of booklets in there to help them express their emotions and things like that. Accessibility passports are something that's starting to be used by clubs a bit as well, where instead of having to wear sort of a sunflower lanyard or something very visible to ask for help, this is a more discreet way of being able to include some information about their disability and have some contact details for somebody to get in touch with if they have any issues, and they can show that to stewards or members of staff at clubs. And this is an accessibility map down at the bottom. This is actually Wimbledon. This is an incredibly detailed one because obviously Wimbledon, the tennis Wimbledon is a big place, but this shows in detail all of the different accessible features and facilities at the Wimbledon Championships. And then finally here at the bottom right, this is an example of a good example of signage. This is from West Bromwich Albion. It includes this sort of note at the top to say not all disabilities are visible, which is again one of the points from the video, and something that increasingly we're needing to raise awareness about. And then also, in case you're wondering what this big RH here is, this is a right-hand transfer toilet. So they also have an LH for a left-hand transfer toilet, and this is to allow you to sort of lower yourself down to the toilet either using your right or left hand. So again, just really helpful signage, really thinking about what disabled people might need to know, and that's come about through consultation with disabled supporters themselves. Just going back to that point on accessible toilets, we did come across a situation where a steward was there at an accessible toilet for a game, and a boy came up to use the accessible toilet, and the steward said to him, well, you're not disabled, turned the boy away, and the boy got very upset, understandably, went to his father, and it turned out actually that the boy was disabled. He had a stoma bag and wasn't able to sort of persuade the steward that he was disabled. His father was understandably very upset, and this turned out to become a legal case and was found in favour of the boy and his father. So with things like this, we appreciate that clubs have a responsibility to protect those services and facilities for disabled people, but always give the benefit of the doubt. Always don't make those assumptions that somebody isn't disabled because they don't look disabled. In fact, this is just a list of some of the non-visible disabilities. I'm not going to go through all of these. I'm not going to read them all out, but these are just some of the things that could be considered as non-visible disabilities. And actually the Equality Act would cover each of these things. So if you are discriminating against anybody with any of these disabilities, they would be covered, they would be protected rather under the Equality Act. So that's the important thing. And it would include things like cancer as well. So clearly there's lots of different things that, as organizations, we really need to be aware of providing these adjustments, these reasonable adjustments for people with lots of different disabilities. If that seems overwhelming, well, I'd encourage you to think about how you can engage with disabled people themselves. So to different clubs, we encourage them to engage with their disabled fans, to think about consultation, setting up different meetings where they can engage with disabled supporters, setting up a disabled supporters association to find out from the disabled supporters themselves what are some of the access issues that you have, what do we need to change to make this place more inclusive and accessible, and to really get that feedback from fans themselves. There are various forums for this. We have a national forum that we run each year where fans and clubs can come together to have that kind of dialogue. And just, an encouragement to really take on board the feedback that you get from disabled supporters. As I said before, many disabled people feel dismissed and they're not properly heard. But feedback is so valuable because it helps you to understand and to be able to make those necessary changes. Just to conclude then, when you have communicated with disabled supporters, when you are clear about what are the changes that you need to make within your organisation to make it more engaging, to make it more inclusive and accessible, it's important to communicate that across the organisation to really get buy-in from everybody, to have a clear message about what the change is, to engage everyone at your organisation and the community. And for that to be from the top down and bottom up, there needs to be buy-in from everybody. If you just have one person at an organisation who's trying to drive change to make it more accessible, then oftentimes they'll struggle unless they can really get buy-in from the rest of the organisation. And just to keep communicating the benefits of access to the community, to organisations and staff, and to individuals. I think that's probably a good place to stop. I've slightly overrun, but I think that's probably a good place to stop. So I hand back over.
Great, thank you very much, Daniel. Very valuable discussion, really great takeaways for people who are listening. I guess a question which I wanted to pose to you initially was sort of what some of the main reasons that disabled supporters have highlighted to Level Playing Field and yourself as to why they don't always feel included. I think that could be really valuable to those listening.
I think so. As I've sort of said, people often contact us to say that they don't feel heard, they don't feel listened to, they don't feel as valued. Some examples of that could be things like sight lines is a big one. So for wheelchair users, if they're in a wheelchair user space that's sort of back in the stands, people end up standing up in front of them. They can't see the game. And this may be something they speak to stewards about, to say, look, we can't see the game. It might be something that they've mentioned 7, 8, 9 times to the club, and the club's not done anything about it. And so it's things like that make disabled people feel like they're not valued. If you turn up to a game and you can't see anything, then what's the point of being there? So that would be just one example. Another thing that we get complaints about quite a lot is things like ticketing. Disabled people often will have to sort of purchase tickets in a different way to everyone else. They might not have the same options for buying as everyone else. They might not be able to go online and be able to purchase as easily if they require a personal assistant to attend with them, for example. They might have to phone like a premium line number in order to sort that out, which obviously is not ideal and is discriminating against that disabled person. So a lot of the time it's, as I've sort of said throughout, disabled people just want to be treated as people at the end of the day. They want to be treated in the same way as everyone else, except for their access requirements. They just want those reasonable adjustments to be made to enable them to get to the games. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Another question that I had is sort of on the sort of perspective of a sports venue, sports property, who is maybe anxious about engaging with their disabled supporters because they perceive that they might not be able to implement some of the feedback. What advice would you give to a sports property or a sports venue to sort of overcome those challenges and the best way to actually sort of communicate that dialogue?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think definitely that's the case. I think there are lots of clubs who would prefer to just bury their heads in the sand and not engage, because they know that there are things that are wrong, and they either can't change the infrastructure or can't afford to make those changes. I think attitude plays a big part. If clubs are seeking to do what they can and to really address the issues that they are able to change, to make improvements where they can, then I think the majority of disabled supporters will see that, will appreciate it. I think honesty is really valuable, is really important. Having forums, having places like those consultation sort of groups that I was talking about, it is really valuable. Having those contexts where you can have that two-way dialogue, so that fans can explain to the club, like, this isn't okay, like, we can't access this service or facility, and that works the other way, so the clubs are able to say, actually there's nothing we can do about that, but maybe we could make these other reasonable adjustments instead. We can't change the infrastructure, but maybe we could do this as an alternative, and just really trying to come up with the best solutions in that two-way dialogue. Just one example recently was Wycombe Wanderers. Actually, they invited some of the disabled supporters to attend the venue on a non-match day, just to walk around the ground with the disability access officer, and to point out the areas of the ground which were problematic. So, that level of intentionality, that level of sort of really wanting that really good feedback, if you seek it, then yeah, you should be able to get that from your supporters.
Tremendous. Now, actually, my follow-up question was an example of where a sports club or venue had sort of done positive consultation with disabled supporters. So thanks for providing that example. Do you think any particular sports do sort of disability inclusion better than others?
I don't know. So I've been in the job sort of a couple of years now. Most of my work does revolve around football. Actually, a lot of the training that I've delivered has been to rugby union. But in terms of my knowledge of the venues and the services they provide, my knowledge is more around football. I think different venues and different sports have different challenges. We did deliver some training at horse racing, and obviously, a venue like that is completely different and would have completely different challenges to, say, a football stadium or a rugby stadium, for example. But I think, to be honest, it's probably more, club by club rather than sport by sport. Even within football, there are some clubs who are really keen, really desperate to be as inclusive and to make the changes, and others who, as I said before, just want to bury their heads in the sand and hope that they can get away with as little as possible, and doing the legal minimum, really. So, yeah.
Okay, no, great, thank you. We have had a question through in the Q&A, so thank you to the anonymous attendee who's posed this question. They say, that was a great presentation, Daniel, thank you. I was really struck by the social model of disability, which is something I'm trying to champion internally around our use of language more broadly. I've often heard of disabled people referred to as vulnerable or at risk. What are your views on this deficit-based language being used, and sort of the future of that potential approach?
Yeah, it's probably not the most helpful language to use, because it is very medical model, and you're talking about people being vulnerable, and it's also not necessarily accurate. There are lots of disabled people who aren't actually necessarily any more vulnerable, because disabilities vary so widely, and if we're trying to get people to think about non-visible disabilities and a broad range of different types of disabilities, actually lots of those wouldn't include sort of people who are more vulnerable. If you're talking about people who are more vulnerable, then I think that terminology is okay if it's appropriate to what you're discussing. So you can talk about vulnerable adults, in a safeguarding context if they are more vulnerable, for example. That might be people with learning difficulties or something like that, learning disabilities. But on the whole, to describe all disabled people as vulnerable is not the most helpful. I know the government recently have been talking about clinically extremely vulnerable people in relation to COVID. And again, it's appropriate within a certain context. Obviously describes a group of people who are clinically extremely vulnerable, and there's a reason for that. But yeah, I won't go into more details on that. Yeah, I think I've answered the question.
No, fantastic. I think one of the things that struck me in your presentation, you alluded to the term inspirational, which reminded me we did a panel discussion a couple of weeks ago on disability inclusion. and a member of the Harlequins Foundation. Claudia is a wheelchair user herself, and she spoke about that sort of language being used. Actually, there's a very helpful TED talk on the topic itself, which I'll probably share potentially with those who are listening today. Are there any other sort of superlatives or language similar to the inspirational term that you sort of view as something that as a society we should probably use less?
Well, there's another one that was used in there, which was to say that they're so brave. I guess brave is very similar to inspirational. Yeah, I think they're probably the ones that I've heard that have sort of been used the most, that people don't like. You know, there are various terms like wheelchair bound. There seems to be quite a big hang up over disabled people or people with disabilities. You know, personally, I don't see a huge difference. Like, essentially, the idea is that it's the person that's important. They're a person first and foremost. They're disabled, but you know, if the language that you're using is treating a disabled person as a person first and foremost, then that's the important thing. Yeah, I think just avoid sort of cliches and avoid yeah, just anything that if you feel like you want to sort of tell somebody that they're inspirational or brave, then actually ask yourself the question, is what they're doing actually inspirational or brave, or am I trying to just be compassionate about the fact that they're disabled? And maybe ask yourself that question first.
Very, very valid there, thank you. We've had another anonymous question come through, so thank you for posing that to us. They say, great presentation. Do you have any thoughts on how to spread this message more widely in society? They see a lot of news about racism, sexism, etc., but comparably less about disability. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, definitely. I think going back to the illustration of the signage that I used, I think one of the reasons why people immediately sort of jump on the woman who's changing the baby is because in some ways I think it's been more ingrained in us to look out for those things, to look out for any examples of sexism or racism in society. And yeah, definitely disability has much less coverage in the media, in the press, and in society. I think it's important not to beat people up over this. You know, if people use the wrong terminology, if people accidentally say the wrong thing, I think we've got to be careful not to demonize people, because we don't want to stop people from engaging with disabled people or just around disability issues in general. So I'd encourage you just, I think, where people are being genuine and wanting to engage in the right way, you know, to encourage them in that, and maybe sort of gently correct language, possibly where you can. Where there's outright discrimination and where there's outright sort of abuse, yeah, we need to get better as a society at standing up against that and defending the rights of disabled people. I think, you know, you can obviously do that within your own context, within your own workplace and family, probably more easily than something on social media, where I feel like it's probably not the best place for helpful discussion and yeah, productive debate. But yeah, if within your own circles of influence, you're sort of encouraging people to treat disabled people better and to really look for those ways in which we can be more inclusive, then I think that's what we all need to do.
No, I agree with you. I think that there's a lot to be said about allyship, and a lot to be said about the approaches to appropriate sort of discussion and how to appropriately challenge someone if you do hear language that is not inclusive, and just the way in which you pose that feedback, basically how you respond to it as well. Just as you said, not demonize the idea that everyone's going to get something wrong, but just how you pose that correction, but also how you respond to it says a lot as well. So I think that's really valuable, as you said, as to how we go about correcting language and not being afraid to do it, but also not being afraid to say, sorry, I wasn't aware, that was my mistake.
Yeah.
A question I had for you, and I'm conscious you may not have the answer to this. I was fortunate to spend a number of years working in the US, and we, from an arena perspective, we had to abide by the ADA, American Disabilities Act. How do you think the UK compares on a global level in regards to sort of disability inclusion from a sports venue perspective?
So I can't compare it with the States very easily, but in terms of the rest of Europe, I think we are comfortably ahead of the rest of Europe in terms of the, you know, both the legal side of things and just generally a desire to make changes. So CAFE, I mentioned in the presentation. CAFE are a very similar organisation to us, but they do work across Europe. So it's the Centre for Access to Football in Europe, is CAFE, and they work, you know, throughout Europe, and they basically keep referring to the UK and what we're doing here almost as a sort of as a best practice or example of what to aspire to. And that's not to say that we are, you know, the finished article here by any stretch of the imagination. There's still lots of work to be done here in the UK, but compared with a lot of the countries across Europe, actually we're quite a way ahead. I think having a requirement for a disability access officer, or certainly at the very least having somebody who's responsible for disability access at each club is a big deal to drive things forward, to keep making those changes, and that's not a requirement for a lot of places, so things tend to just slip and not get noticed really if there's nobody really trying to drive that change.
No, completely. And as you said, if it's not someone championing for cause or against championing those considerations internally, it's very true that they may get missed. So, but it's good to hear that the UK does perform well across from a European perspective. We've had another couple of questions coming in the Q&A, so thank you to those who've submitted them. Another anonymous attendee has said, very interesting presentation. They're initially surprised by the 20% statistic, but not when you showed the slide of what it included. The question they ask is, does it create its own issue, potentially, of it being such a wide definition? The example they give, they have friends in a number of those categories, and I don't think all of them would believe to be defined in that particular way. For example, a wheelchair user versus potentially someone who is a cancer sufferer or someone with Crohn's.
Yeah.
I guess the overall question is, does the broad nature of the term disability create some other challenges, I suppose?
So there is a legal definition of disability. It's not a subjective thing. It's not something that it's sort of, you know, you go around and you ask who considers themselves to be disabled, and if they consider themselves to be disabled, they are included. So the legal definition is somebody with a, I can't remember the exact wording, apologies, but it has to be long-term and substantial. They're the two, essentially the two key factors. So it has to have a substantial effect on their ability to do normal day-to-day activities, and it has to be long-term, which I think is over a year. And if it is those things, then it counts as a disability, regardless of whether or not the person would describe themselves as being disabled. And that's not us saying, you know, everybody who is legally disabled must just define themselves as disabled. That's not the case at all. But the important thing is that they would be protected under the Equality Act. So that's the main reason for that. Is within the Equality Act, you know, disability is one of the categories, one of, I think, 12 different characteristics that's protected, and whichever one of those non-visible disabilities you have, if you're discriminated against for that reason, then you are protected under the Equality Act. I'll just give you one quick example. There was somebody who had a large facial birthmark, and again, you might think, well, you know, that's not really going to stop you being able to live your life or do normal day-to-day activities. This person with a large facial birthmark went with their partner to a restaurant, and they went and sat down at a table at the front of the restaurant by the window. And the owner of the restaurant came and asked them to move to the back. And the reason being that the owner of the restaurant didn't want people walking past the restaurant, seeing this person with a large facial birthmark and being put off from coming in. And so they were asked to move. And so it might seem silly to call somebody disabled because they've got a large facial birthmark, but actually, if they weren't protected, if their rights weren't protected because of that facial birthmark, then something like that they could just get away with it. The manager could just get away with it, but actually they are protected, so their disability is protected in that sense. And so that's why it is that way. But yeah, that's not at all to say that we need to tell people that they have to identify as disabled. That's not the idea behind it. But we do need to make sure that we're accommodating different people's access requirements, which is the legitimate point.
Yeah, no, exactly. I think it's part of sort of holistic inclusion and making sure that everyone is covered and supported. Very valid point. Thank you. A few minutes left. We do have another question come through. Thank you, Nikki, for this question. They say, with an aging population and the impact that might have on supporters groups, and dementia being more of a visible condition in society, did Level Playing Field have a model that could help clubs make arenas, stadiums more dementia friendly?
It's a good question. We haven't done a lot of work in terms of making stadiums more accessible or dementia friendly. I know that there are a couple of clubs, a couple of stadiums. Watford, for example, have got a sensory room that they use. So sensory rooms are often used for autistic supporters, but they use their sensory room in midweek for a dementia group to come along and yeah, to sort of just as a sort of a memories group, really. They sort of share old memories of players, and but then being able to then look out onto the pitch and familiarize themselves with the stadium on a regular basis helps them as well with then attending matches if they are to attend sort of match day as well. So things like that are really good practice. In terms of the actual kind of infrastructure, I don't know. We'll need to do some work on that. But you're absolutely right. We do have an aging population, particularly within sort of sports supporters. The average age is creeping up, and so it's something that definitely we're going to need to be more conscious of moving forward.
Yeah, no, fantastic. And I think the message, which again just being communicated across our various webinars and panel discussions, is things continue to evolve because as society, things change. And again, there's this continued work across various verticals to make sure that we are inclusively minded at the forefront. As a last question, Daniel, I think just to ask, is there anything in particular across disability inclusion that Level Playing Field is particularly focusing on at the moment, or the sort of the long-term goals? And if anyone wants to reach out to Level Playing Field or yourself, what are the best ways to do that?
Yeah, so we've got a couple of things on the go at the moment. We're just launching our annual fan survey. It's probably going to be launched tomorrow, in fact. And we're hoping to get 1,000 responses from supporters, really just to help inform us about fans' experiences. So if that's something that you wanted to fill out, our social media is on Twitter is @LPF tweets. If you have that, we'll be posting tomorrow about the fan survey. And our website is levelplayingfield.org.uk. You can get in touch with us on our website. As I say, we are an advisory service, so more than happy to sort of answer any questions that you might have free of charge. We do our best to try and stay on top of all the latest information as much as we can. You asked something else as well. Sorry, I couldn't remember other things.
No, I think you covered both.
I covered it.
Your main target over the short term, long term, and also just ways to get in touch with you, which I think you covered both of those, I think.
Yeah. The other thing, obviously, as well at the moment is fans returning to stadiums. So that's been our big sort of thing that we've been focusing on and trying to advise clubs over. So yeah, that will be ongoing until every club's got supporters back, which the government guidance keeps changing, and so it's one of those things that you just have to keep staying on top of, really. But just making sure that with any new COVID measures that are put into place, that they are disability friendly as well is a big thing that we're looking at the moment. Yeah.
Completely, and I think I can attest to the value of the resources Level Playing Field provide. I know that from a Harlequins perspective, I shared the information regarding face mask exemptions and just understanding the journey that disabled supporters may be facing coming back to a sports stadia for the first time. So I can attest to the value of your work. And I will say that Harlequins will also be supporting the fan survey that you mentioned. I've not responded to your email about that, but I will. We will be supporting it. So just from my perspective, thank you so much for the work that you do Today has been incredibly valuable. Thank you to everyone who has listened and provided questions. We will look to share some resources, which Daniel has kindly provided to us, in addition to a copy of this presentation for your future resource. And yeah, just thank you again, Daniel, for today. Great to have your time. And for everyone listening as well, just to let you know, we have our next event is next Wednesday evening at 7 p.m. Panel discussion on race and ethnicity, tackling language, terminology, and intersectionality. So I'll provide details of that in the post-event survey. And once again, thank you so much for your support. And please reach out to us if you have any further questions.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Daniel. Have a great day.
Thanks.